It's 1943, the dead of night in the North Atlantic. The ocean is black and endless, with only the faint glow of the moon lighting the waves. Deep beneath the surface, a German U-boat drifts silently, its captain listening through the hydrophone, straining to detect the faintest sound of enemy ships. Suddenly, a sharp rhythmic ping echoes through the water. Sonar. Within seconds, the crew knows. The hunters have found them. The destroyer Escort is closing in. Welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most terrifying experiences any German U-boat captain could face: the relentless, calculated, and deadly hunt by U.S. destroyer escorts. These small but powerful ships turned the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic, transforming what was once called the happy time for U-boat crews into a nightmare they couldn't escape. Let's rewind to the early years of World War II. From 1939 to 1941, German U-boats prowled the Atlantic almost unchallenged. Their mission was simple: cut off Britain's lifeline by sinking merchant convoys bringing food, fuel, and war materials. They were good at it, terrifyingly good. Entire convoys disappeared beneath the waves, and Allied shipping losses skyrocketed. For the men aboard these U-boats, life was harsh but filled with a grim sense of purpose. They were the hunters, the predators of the Atlantic. But everything was about to change. By 1942, the United States had fully entered the war. American shipyards were working around the clock, churning out Liberty ships, destroyers, and crucially, destroyer escorts. Unlike the large fleet destroyers, these new escorts were smaller, cheaper, and built specifically to guard convoys and hunt submarines. Their introduction would spell disaster for the U-boat campaign. Equipped with advanced sonar, radar, and deadly anti-submarine weapons like hedgehogs and depth charges, these escorts turned the Atlantic into a death trap for U-boats. No longer were the U-boats free to stalk convoys at will. Now, they were the ones being stalked. And for the men commanding those submarines, the U-boat captains who had once ruled the seas, nothing was more terrifying than hearing the sound of an approaching destroyer escort. Its sonar ping growing louder, closer, more certain with every second. In this video, we'll uncover how these ships changed the course of the Battle of the Atlantic, explore first-hand accounts from both sides, and discover why U-boat captains feared them above all else. To understand why German U-boat captains became so terrified, we have to look at how confident, even arrogant, they were at the beginning of the war. From September 1939 to mid-1941, Admiral Karl Dönitz and his U-boat fleet practically had the Atlantic to themselves. This period became known as Die glückliche Zeit, the happy time. U-boats hunted in wolf packs, coordinating attacks on slow, vulnerable convoys. Captains like Gunther Prien, Otto Kretschmer, and Erich Topp became national heroes in Germany, celebrated for their incredible kill counts. Merchant ships burned on the horizon night after night. For a time, Britain's survival seemed uncertain. Winston Churchill later admitted that the U-boat menace was the only thing that truly frightened him during the war, and for good reason. Shipping losses were catastrophic, but as 1941 turned to 1942, cracks began to show in Germany's dominance. The Allies were adapting. Convoy systems became tighter. Radar-equipped patrol aircraft started flying longer missions. The U.S. Navy entered the war and brought its industrial might with it. And most importantly, American shipyards began mass-producing a new type of ship that would change everything: the destroyer escort. Destroyer escorts were not as glamorous as fleet destroyers. They were smaller, slower, and cheaper. But that was the point. They could be built quickly, in massive numbers, and deployed everywhere convoys needed protection. They were designed with one purpose: hunt submarines. By early 1943, the first destroyer escorts were escorting convoys across the Atlantic. They were bristling with sonar gear, radar sets, depth charge racks, and the brand new Hedgehog, and a head-throwing anti-submarine mortar that could destroy a submarine with pinpoint accuracy without losing sonar contact. For U-boat captains, the game had changed almost overnight. Before, they could attack at night on the surface, using their superior speed to slip away. But with radar, destroyer escorts could detect them even in pitch-black darkness. The once feared wolf packs suddenly found themselves hunted. Reports began reaching Admiral Dönitz's headquarters that entire U-boats were vanishing, not even getting off a final transmission. Survivors who were rescued told harrowing tales of hours-long hunts, with sonar pings echoing through the hull, depth charges shaking the boat to its rivets, and no escape route left. By mid-1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached its turning point. In May of that year, what became known as Black May for the U-boat force, Germany lost 41 submarines in a single month. Many of those kills were credited to aggressive destroyer escorts leading convoy screens. From this point on, the fear became palpable. Captains who once boasted about their tonnage sunk now spoke quietly about the terrifying efficiency of the American convoy escorts, and the worst was yet to come. By the summer of 1943, the Atlantic had turned into a deadly hunting ground, but now, it was the hunters who were being hunted. German U-boat captains who had once roamed freely were suddenly living in constant fear of the very convoys they used to stalk. Imagine being aboard a Type 7 U-boat submerged at periscope depth, scanning the horizon for targets, when suddenly your hydrophone operator hears it, the faint, unmistakable rhythm of propellers. Not just one set, but several. Destroyer escorts were out there, circling like wolves, but this time you were the prey. The terror wasn't just in the sound of the approaching ships. It was in the technology they carried. The Americans had developed HFDF, high-frequency direction finding, which could triangulate a U-boat's radio transmission in minutes. If a captain radioed a report back to headquarters, within hours a hunter-killer group could be on top of him. And then there was radar. Before radar, U-boats had used the cover of darkness as their shield. Now, destroyer escorts could see them on the surface miles away, no matter how black the night was. What followed was often a merciless game of cat and mouse. Eyewitness accounts from U-boat crews tell chilling stories. Depth charges didn't just explode, they crushed men's nerves. The pressure wave would rattle every bolt, the lights would flicker, gauges would spin, and water would spray from loosened seals. The crew had to remain silent and still, praying their boat wouldn't be cracked open like an egg. Some captains described hours-long hunts where destroyer escorts kept contact relentlessly, taking turns dropping patterns of charges. These ships worked in coordinated teams, communicating by radio, attacking from multiple angles, and leaving no escape route. It was psychological warfare. The Hedgehog weapon made it worse. Unlike depth charges, which exploded at preset depths, Hedgehog bombs only detonated on contact. That meant if they missed, there was no explosion. But if they hit, the entire boat could be obliterated in a single instant. Survivors said that the silence of a missed Hedgehog salvo was almost worse than the deafening roar of depth charges, because it meant the escorts still had a perfect fix on them and were simply lining up for another shot. In some cases, destroyer escorts hunted U-boats for over 24 hours before finally forcing them to surface. Battered, leaking, and out of air, at which point the escorts would open fire or capture the crew. German morale plummeted. In one report, a U-boat captain described the Atlantic as a steel trap. He wrote, "We are no longer the hunters, we are the hunted, and death comes from every direction. From the sea, from the air, from the very silence that surrounds us." For the first time in the war, Admiral Dunitz began recalling his boats from the North Atlantic, admitting that losses had reached an unacceptable level. But even as U-boat numbers thinned, the Americans doubled down, forming hunter-killer groups built specifically to track and destroy submarines, not just escort convoys. And soon, these groups would take the fight straight to the heart of the U-boat fleet. By late 1943, the battle in the Atlantic had completely changed. The German U-boat fleet was still active, but now every sortie felt like a death sentence. The Americans had perfected the use of their destroyer escorts, turning them into highly coordinated, relentless submarine hunters. A turning point came with the full integration of escort carriers, small aircraft carriers that sailed alongside destroyer escorts, providing air cover and reconnaissance. Suddenly, the U-boats couldn't even surface during the day without risking detection by aircraft. The ocean, once their sanctuary, was now a giant killing field. Destroyer escorts worked as part of hunter-killer teams. Their tactics were methodical and terrifying for the U-boat crews. First came radar detection, a faint blip indicating a submarine was near the surface. Then came the sonar pings bouncing off the hull, letting the escorts know exactly where to aim their depth charges. Many U-boat survivors would later describe this experience as psychological torture. The pinging sound of sonar meant death was coming. The pings grew louder as the escort closed in, followed by a thundering explosion that shook every bone in their body. And the Americans weren't just using explosives. They began employing new technologies like the FIDO homing torpedo, an acoustic torpedo dropped by aircraft that could track a submarine's propeller noise. German crews tried desperate measures to evade them, cutting engines, staying perfectly still, or releasing decoys, but their success rate dwindled with each passing month. One of the most famous hunter-killer groups was built around the USS Card, a bow-glass escort carrier, supported by multiple destroyer escorts. In one 30-day patrol, this single group sank 11 U-boats. 11. For the Germans, this was catastrophic, not just in terms of losses, but in morale. The sheer persistence of destroyer escorts broke U-boat crews psychologically. Captured German sailors later admitted that many of them feared the destroyers more than death itself. One prisoner reportedly said, "The sound of your depth charges, it never stops. It is like the hammer of God pounding on our skulls. We wait, we pray, and we know the next one could be the last." By 1944, the Allies were winning the Battle of the Atlantic decisively. German commanders were forced to keep their boats submerged for longer periods, which severely limited their range and effectiveness. Some U-boats would spend days underwater, with the air turning foul, carbon dioxide levels rising, and the men collapsing from exhaustion and fear. The turning point became clear. U-boats were no longer a decisive threat. Instead of the dreaded wolf packs hunting convoys, now it was the Americans and their destroyer escorts hunting down the wolves, one by one. This relentless pressure changed Denitz's entire strategy. He began pulling U-boats back from the most heavily patrolled lanes, ordering them to operate farther south, near Africa and the Caribbean, hoping to find safer hunting grounds. But even there, destroyer escorts followed, proving that there was nowhere left to hide. The Atlantic, once the graveyard of Allied shipping, had now become the graveyard of the U-boat fleet. By 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached its decisive climax, and the destroyer escorts were the stars of the show. German U-boat captains had once been considered the elite of the Kriegsmarine, fearless hunters who had brought Britain to the brink of starvation. But now, they were broken men. Many of them described leaving port with the dreadful certainty that they would never return. The climax came with a series of brutal engagements in mid-1944. Hunter-killer groups composed of escort carriers and their destroyer escorts swept entire sectors of the Atlantic, searching for submarines and striking with ruthless efficiency. The USS Guadalcanal's group, for instance, famously captured U-505, one of only a handful of U-boats ever boarded and seized intact. The capture of U-505 was a stunning success. It gave the Allies access to Enigma codebooks and advanced German torpedo technology, accelerating the intelligence war and making U-boat operations even riskier. For the Germans, it was a humiliation, proof that their once invincible submarines could be taken like trophies. But perhaps the most dramatic encounters were the ones that ended with U-boats forced to surface after hours of depth charge attacks. Imagine it, a black Atlantic night, a crippled submarine breaking the surface, men spilling out onto the deck, some waving white flags, others trying desperately to man their deck guns, and all around them destroyer escorts opening fire with their main batteries, searchlights cutting through the darkness, the water boiling with explosions. Many of these battles were over in minutes. Some U-boats scuttled themselves rather than be captured. Others surrendered, their crews too exhausted and terrified to keep fighting. By late 1944, U-boat losses were staggering. Nearly 3/4 of all German submariners would not survive the war, one of the highest casualty rates of any branch in World War II. For those who did survive, many spoke later about the sheer psychological toll of the destroyer escorts' relentless hunts. The Atlantic was no longer an open battlefield, it was a coffin. The resolution was clear: the U-boat menace had been crushed. The once unstoppable wolf packs had been decimated, and Allied shipping lanes were finally secure. Supplies, troops and equipment could flow freely across the ocean, fueling the liberation of Europe. The destroyer escorts, though less glamorous than battleships or aircraft carriers, had played a critical role in turning the tide of the war. Their combination of speed, radar, sonar, and coordinated tactics made them the nightmare of every U-boat captain. In a sense, this was the final act of the Battle of the Atlantic, the point at which the hunters became the hunted, and the U-boat threat was permanently broken. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the toll on the U-boat arm was staggering. Of the roughly 40,000 German sailors who had served aboard U-boats, more than 30,000 were dead, a casualty rate of nearly 75%. It was one of the most dangerous assignments in all of World War II. And yet, here's the surprising twist. Even after Germany's surrender, the destroyer escorts mission wasn't quite over. Some U-boats tried to escape rather than surrender, attempting to reach South America or even Japan. American hunter-killer groups, still patrolling the seas, intercepted several of them, forcing their surrender on the open ocean. In one case, a U-boat captain scuttled his own vessel in a last act of defiance, rather than let it fall into Allied hands. The legacy of the destroyer escorts was immense. They were the quiet heroes of the Battle of the Atlantic. Smaller, less celebrated than the fleet destroyers or battleships, but absolutely decisive. Without them, the convoys might never have gotten through, and the D-Day invasion might have been delayed or even impossible. Today, a few of these legendary ships survive as museum vessels, reminders of their role in saving the Atlantic lifeline. Standing on their decks, one can almost hear the sonar pings, the roar of depth charges, and the tense silence before the next attack. For the men who served aboard them, it was a battle of nerves and endurance as much as technology. They fought not for glory, but to protect the flow of supplies that made victory possible, and they succeeded. So next time you think of World War II naval warfare, don't just picture the massive battleships or the aircraft carriers. Remember the destroyer escorts, the hunters who turned the tide against the wolves of the Atlantic. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most dramatic naval battles of World War II, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. We've got plenty more untold stories of bravery, technology, and human endurance coming your way. Don't miss the next one.